Hello, everyone. My name is Aisha Langford, and I'm the founder of Funeral Syllabus. Our motto is make a plan, keep the peace, leave a legacy. Today, I'll be talking about funeral planning with Douglas Dutch Nye II. He is the owner, president slash CEO, and funeral director of Nye Family Funeral Home and Cremation Service Incorporated, which has 3 locations in Southeast Michigan. The goal of today's podcast is really to demystify funeral planning and to normalize conversations around end-of-life issues. So, Mr. Nye, most people don't wake up, in the 3rd grade and say, I want to be a funeral director. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey into the funeral home business and what motivated you to become a funeral director?
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me today and allowing me to share my story. So, you're right. In 3rd grade, you usually don't do that. I was kind of in a unique situation where my parents owned a funeral home, and I actually grew up above the funeral home with my 6 sisters. So it was something that, from a very young age, I kind of knew about. And as I got to be a little bit older, I started to help my parents in the business, mowing the grass and washing cars. And when I got into high school, helping my parents parking cars that would come to the funeral home, cleaning up and things like that. So for me, at the time when I was younger in the 70s and 80s, a lot of the funeral homes, the folks that were coming to the funeral service were, we call them legacy children. We were sons and daughters of funeral directors. So I grew up in the funeral business or above the funeral home. And when I graduated high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. My parents wanted me to, come into the funeral business, but I wanted to become a sheriff's deputy. So I ended up joining the Air Force, and I served 8 years as a military policeman, thinking I was going to become a sheriff's deputy. And then as I was completing my second tour of duty before I would reenlist the 3rd time, my wife and I had started a family. And I kind of, being away from the funeral service, I said I was, serving globally, and I realized my parents were serving locally. And I decided to come back to the family business and went to mortuary school down in Detroit at Wayne State University. And at the time when I was in school, the majority of the class was predominantly male. About 70% were males, and about 60 to 70% were legacy students where they had a connection to a funeral home. Now, currently, my son is at Wayne State doing a mortuary program. So that'll be our 3rd generation. And
Wow.
his class is about 80% female and about 80% first generation. So him as a male and having funeral background is a minority. So there's been quite a shift in the last 30, 40 years of funeral service, but that's how I got started and how I became involved.
Okay. Wow, that's super interesting. So my next question is a little not sad. Well, I guess it is sad. So at some point in our lives, it is very possible that we may be the actual person to find a loved one or a family friend dead, maybe in their home. Sometimes you haven't heard from folks in a few days and you go and, just check on them. So if that happens, if you literally find someone dead somewhere, who do you call first? Are you supposed to call 911 or like a pastor or a hospital, or like what should people do?
So if a death occurs outside of a hospital or a nursing home and things like that, then there are a lot of different possibilities. Like you mentioned, a sudden death, like maybe you were checking on a neighbor or something and you found them. In that case, you would need to call 911 and just let them know that you found somebody that appears deceased. And then they'll dispatch the police, and then the police will then get in contact with the medical examiner or the coroner, depending on what part of the country you're in. And then they'll come out and then pronounce that person deceased and then bring them into their care. And then usually if it's unexpected like that, there might be a follow-up investigation, which is done at the medical examiner or the coroner's office to determine the cause of death. Now, over the last 40, 50 years, there's been the hospice movement in the United States is really become very popular. So there are more people dying outside of an institution say a hospital and things like that. So in those cases, if somebody is at home, but they're under hospice care or a doctor's supervision, there could be something where the hospice nurse was there during the day and overnight, the person might die overnight and you might be in the home, and in the morning you go check on mom or dad and then they're deceased. In that case, you would just get a hold of the hospice nurse or the hospice organization that you are working with, and they will bring the nurse in to pronounce the death. So there's not a need for the lights and the sirens because it's been expected. There's kind of, when you enter hospice, there is kind of a expectation that this is the end of life. So that type of home death does not require any type of 911 or emergency or medical examiner investigation. If you're, again, not in a home, but let's say you're in the park or you're somewhere else, you do that, again, 911 would be the first action to take, and then the authorities would know what to do from there.
Okay.
And the one thing is, if you do come upon somebody like that, of course, if you see somebody laying on the ground or something like that, you'll want to, maybe see if they're breathing and things like that, or do life-saving things. But if you've determined that they're not, you shouldn't disturb the area just because there might be some investigation that needs to take place. But you don't want to not do anything just in case you could help with CPR. So there's that fine balancing act. And you can usually determine if someone's been deceased for a little bit, just in the temperature and maybe some of the colorations and things like that.
Okay. And you mentioned hospice. I'll actually be interviewing someone who is in the hospice and palliative care industry. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that scenario as well. So if once a person is deceased and the family, I guess, has decisions to make. So what is typically involved with planning a funeral versus a cremation or a memorial service? Or are they kind of similar processes, or are there different steps for funeral, cremation, or a memorial service?
Sure, that's a great question, and sometimes it is confusing because we as a society are kind of death denying, like we don't like to talk about this. And I'm so happy that you have this forum to just demystify death and dying. So the whole idea about memorial service, a funeral, the reason that we do it is because someone has lived that they have marked in our lives. So what we need to do as a community is to have a celebration of that life. It can come in many different forms. It can come, but the whole idea is to remember the person who lived, recognize that they are gone, and that there will be a new normal living without that person. But what it does with a funeral, a memorial service, a celebration of life, or whatever it goes by, is that community can come and recognize the person has died, but also that they have lived, and share the stories, the memories. And then also for the people, that the family that is left, it lets the community know and share that they are different now. They will heal, but they'll never be the same. And sometimes we'll find folks that decide, well, let's just not have anything. This has been too painful. I just want to move on. And then we find out, later on, they wish that they would have had a service, whatever that service might be. It might be religious because that's their background. It might be gathering with friends and family in their home or a park. It might be, if they have religious beliefs, maybe a big church service and things. But we find that they'll say, I didn't have a service and I relived that death 50 times when I'm in the grocery store and someone asks, how's your mom or your dad doing? And then I have to tell them, well, they passed away. And then you just relive that versus sharing a moment where you can come together and you find out a lot of different things about someone that you might not know. Their coworkers bring a different profile. So we mark a lot of the things that we do, a new birth, a retirement, a wedding, things like that. In a funeral or memorial service or celebrating a life is another milestone in someone's life that should be remembered. It might be sad because you're going to miss them, but it's important for the healing process to do that. So having that being said, that service of remembrance can take place. And then the disposition afterwards, the cremation, the entombment, if they're going to a mausoleum, the body donation, whatever that disposition can take place after that memorial service. So the different things, a funeral, generally a traditional funeral, indicates that the body is going to be present. In some case, they'd be in the casket. The casket could be open or closed, but the body will be present at a funeral service. Usually, a memorial service, the body's not present. That they might have been cremated, or they might be cremated or buried. They might have a burial before the memorial service, but the service itself is to remember the life. So those are just a little bit differences in the terminology, but the idea is to have some type of remembrance service that you can share with your loved one and with the community.
Okay. It's very important. So speaking of funerals and I guess cremations and other things, sometimes it can cost a lot of money. And so if the person didn't have life insurance or for whatever reasons, sometimes it can be several hundreds of dollars or several thousands of dollars. And sometimes families end up going into debt if there wasn't preparation made, or just you just never know what the life situation is. So what are some budget friendly options for people if finances are a real concern, but they still want to honor their loved one?
Right. So there's a lot of different options that are available. And the good thing is that you get to pick those options that you want to, remembering that the most important thing for you to do is have a time to remember and share. Again, it can be happen at your home. If you want to have a church services, there could be expenses for using like the clergy and the music, using the funeral home, things like that. But everyone is in charge of what they choose. So the funeral director, you can explain to them, here's kind of our budget, here's what we're looking to do, and then this is what we want to do. And they can help guide you in the things that will make it appropriate for yourself and your budget. It can be very dignified and be low cost too, but being upfront and just explaining this is what we have to work with. If you do have life insurance that you mentioned, then that can offset that. But folks that don't have life insurance, you can certainly pick services that are dignified and things like that. Now, there will be different expenses for a funeral because there's other preparation. The body is present. The casket is selected. If there's going to be a burial, there'll be a burial vault. Most times in the cemetery, you have to purchase a burial plot. And there's more expenses there than if after that service, there's a cremation, which you don't have those expenses. So sometimes people will say, well, we don't want to have, or we don't have cemetery property, or we want to save some money here. Then they'll have their service and then have a cremation following, which won't have a lot of those components. A lot of times the best thing to do is to do a pre-planning. So go in now and talk to your funeral director and say, here's what we'd like to do, so you can get what those costs are. And then you can either just have your wishes on file, which helps your family members. We always, when I sit across the table from a family that's had a prearrangement, there's just an ease and a comfort knowing that the loved one has helped select this. And you can also prepay those arrangements ahead of time, which locks in the cost at today's costs. And then there might be some third-party things like newspaper notices and things that go up, but at least you would have an idea of what those costs are. And then you can make decisions before the time. Once the death occurs, there's a shorter timetable, and sometimes emotions are involved where you want to do something more than you can afford. And the worst thing to do is to have a loss of a loved one, but then also have a financial burden, and nobody wants that. So the best thing to do is to do some research and try to find out what those costs are and if they fit into your budget. Or again, if you do it ahead of time, you can maybe make payments, over time and take care of those so you don't have that burden.
Right. And just to follow up, in general, I realize funerals, the cost really depends on like the type of casket and a bunch of other things. But in general, are funerals typically the most expensive option? And then maybe cremation is like a lot more affordable. I mean, I guess it depends on the state and the home. So I know there's not like exact numbers, but my understanding is
Right.
that funerals are the highest cost and cremation is much more affordable in many situations.
Right. So I would just rephrase that just a little
Okay.
bit to say that a funeral itself will be typically the same. the same
Oh,
cost, the ceremony and things like that. It's the disposition. So the National Funeral Directors Association says that across the country, the average cost of a funeral, a traditional funeral, is about $8,000. And then the average cost of a traditional cremation is about $6,000.
okay.
So the difference in cost are those other pieces that are needed for a burial, the vault and things like that. But the services itself will be very similar. It's just the things that you need to add on to it that sometimes are put together. So yes, having a traditional burial service in a cemetery is going to be more expensive than having a service with a cremation to follow, which would be more expensive than, say, a donation to science or something like that. So it's all those different components that add into it. But you are correct. Having a traditional burial is more expensive than having a traditional cremation. So the funeral and again, sometimes the disposition gets confused with the actual service. So burial, cremation, donation, and then entombment are kind of those dispositions that we have.
And so for the people who haven't been in the funeral industry for a long time, so is the word disposition, what does that mean? Is that literally putting someone into the ground or into a vault, or what does that word mean?
So disposition is the final the resolution to that person. So someone can be buried. That disposition with burial. They could be cremated. So it's the final. What do you do with that human remains? So whether it's entombed in a mausoleum, which is very similar to an earth burial,
Okay.
or cremation. There are some areas in the country that they have they call it aquamation, which is reduction using water. It's water reduction versus a flame reduction, which is cremation. And then there's natural organic reduction, which is kind of like composting. That's a newer disposition. Disposition is just the final what happens to that person once all the ceremony and things are completed.
Okay. And speaking of burials, so I've been hearing more and more about eco-friendly or green burials and what's involved with a green burial and what makes them green.
Sure. So a green burial is it's a burial that without what makes it a green burial, eco-friendly burial, is that there's no chemicals used in the preparation of the deceased. So you don't have then embalming. You might have a washing and dressing, but usually the person is unembalmed. And if they are, there are some non-formaldehyde based fluids that are used. But generally, green burials, there's no embalming. Also, the types of containers or vessels that they would be interred in. So, unlike a traditional burial where you'd have the cemetery, you would have a concrete vault, which is a box that the casket would go inside of. They would not have a vault. The person would be placed into the ground in their casket, or sometimes they'll just be wrapped in a shroud. But the idea is that they'll be returned naturally to the ground. And then they can be buried with a shroud, or they can also be buried in like a lot of times when we do it, it's like a wicker handmade casket or something that will decompose over time. And then usually these parts of the cemetery, they're not mowed, they're more natural. They might not have the traditional headstones and markers. They might have boulders, they might have paths, wild grass and things. And it's more um, they call it natural or green burial. What's interesting is that the green label is it seems like it's a new thing, but there are some religions around the world that this is what they do every day. Like a Jewish burial is a green burial. There's no embalming. They're buried usually on the same day before sun goes down and things like that. So for thousands of years, these burials have been taking place due to religious beliefs. Over the last 20 years, with everybody being more eco-friendly, the
Mhm.
term green burial has become kind of a new term that just is just an immediate burial.
Okay. And you mentioned the word shroud. Is that like a covering, or what is a shroud?
Yeah, so a shroud is it's a piece of a cloth. It could be a
Okay.
burial garment that they would be dressed in. And then also there's sometimes where they'll have the shroud as part of a I would say a basket, not a basket per se, but a pouch that is made out of materials that might have handles on it. And then the person is encased there with in the shroud, in the basic, instead of having like a suit and things on, you're more into this material that will be broken down naturally and things like
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Okay. And are green funerals or burials, are they cheaper? I guess because they don't have, say, the embalming or like the concrete thing that you have to
Vaults.
put, yeah, the vaults. So is it
Yes.
a lot cheaper? I guess people who are choosing these options maybe sometimes be doing it for personal reasons or, earth protection, and maybe not doing it for financial reasons. But I'm just curious if it is slightly cheaper than a traditional burial.
It is. Yes, you don't have the embalming process. You don't have the burial vault that you would need to choose. And what's interesting though is, like you say, some folks will do it for, economical reasons. Other people will do it because of their belief systems. But what's interesting is the containers or the caskets that you choose are more expensive, or about more than what people think. Than they would be compared to a regular casket, because they're handmade. So they're hand woven. So there's a
Oh,
lot of things. So a lot of times the green burial families goes, oh, I didn't think that would be that expensive for a wicker casket. But whereas the traditional caskets can be made, an assembly line and things like that. But
okay.
overall, yes, the expense would be less for a green burial because you don't have those other components involved in that. And then trying to find areas. Most of the country, it's traditional burials, but there are more and more cemeteries that are designating areas to be designated as green burial spaces. So our closest green burial cemetery is about 45 minutes away, and we do quite a few green burials. But we've got probably in our 5 mile radius, we've got about 4 other traditional cemeteries. So there's not as many, but there
Okay.
certainly are becoming more popular. And a lot of traditional cemeteries are just taking part of their property and designating it for green burials.
Okay. And hopefully, people, once this podcast goes live, I'm hoping that people from across the United States and other places will be watching and listening. So we're in Southeast Michigan, but for someone, say, living in New York or California, what are some tips for people to find a trustworthy funeral home? Because you hear all these bad things in the, well, not all the time, but kind of, I've read stories about, a funeral home is doing something crazy, or what would be your tips for finding a trustworthy funeral home? And what kind of questions should people be asking?
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of like you hear the bad things, right? Like a plane crash, but you don't hear about all the planes that land safely.
Right,
So
right,
it's
right.
it's always so. What we find is that a lot of times the number one choice for people choosing funeral homes is normally that they have been served by that family. So if you happen to still live in the area that you grew up, your family might have a funeral home that they've used for 100 years, or 3 or 4 generations and things like that. So you're very familiar with it. But if you've moved out of the area and you're not familiar with the funeral homes, we'll have people come in. We're making arrangements that have moved here. Ann Arbor is a pretty diverse community of people coming and going. And they know their funeral director back home and they trust them and things like that. So if you're in the area that you grew up or you're familiar with, you probably already have that connection there. Now, the National Funeral Directors Association, which is the largest association of funeral directors in the nation and in the world, there's 20,000 members, 11,000 funeral homes. They have set up a consumer-facing website. We have the one that we use for industry about things, but it's called rememberingalife.com. And this website is designed to educate just what you're doing, asking questions, and it gives you checklists of things to ask the funeral director that you want to go visit. But it also has a feature where it says find a funeral home. So what it does is wherever you're living, you type in your zip code, and it will identify all the National Funeral Director Association funeral
Okay.
homes that are in your area. And in order to be a member of the association, there's a code of ethics that you have to abide by and things like that. So that's a great place to start if you're not familiar with your area. And then make an appointment. And like I said, go talk to them and kind of again, Remembering Life has a checklist of things to ask, but just start the conversation of, hey, I just want to get some information. What does this cost? This is what I'm thinking about doing. And then again, because you're doing it ahead of time, you can have follow-up questions, you can have and then along with the resources that are non-biased and not that funeral homes telling you what, you can
Right.
get that information and then make your choices.
Okay, that's great. And actually, you answered all of my questions, but I just, as we come to a close, as you know, talking about death and funerals and cremations, it makes people sad. People don't want to think about it, even though, at some point in our lives, we'll have to deal with death in some kind of way. And I'm just curious, what would you like people to know, or just maybe to alleviate some of their anxieties and concerns about, I guess, funerals and cremations and things like that? Just so people feel a little bit more comfortable, at least thinking about it and talking about it.
Right. I think just talking, communication, that's the key. And you've started it here with your organization, and I give you kudos for that. But we do find that when we're talking with families, there's a lot of uncertainty. Families they don't know, they want to do right. Mom never talked about it, or if mom or dad says, hey, I'd like to, let's go down to the funeral home and let's talk. And a lot of times the kids will be, oh, don't think like that. Don't think like that. But then when it happens, it's on that side. So the advice I give would be to start the conversation. On Remember Your Life, it's called Have the Talk of a Lifetime. And there's a lot of things that you might not even know about your loved one. It talks about, where was your first date? How did you and dad meet? What was this, that, and what's your favorite song? What do you want to do? And those are great conversation starters to have, especially at this time of year. Like we had just had Thanksgiving and you're gathered around, and it doesn't need to be sad. It can be, tell us about this, or tell us like that. What's your wishes and things like that. And again, once the death occurs, it is going to be a very sad situation, but being prepared, we find that families are, very thankful for having that discussion. And we do know it's something that's going to happen, and being prepared for it, and understanding and embracing that grief when the time comes, but knowing that you were not doing something in haste, doing something rushed, something that you might not regret. Knowledge gives you power, right? So
Right.
it's something to you don't have to talk about the sad parts. You can talk about the good things, and then remember a lot, the life that was lived, and then find out what is appropriate for your family. If you're, maybe a quiet family that stays together, you just gather together that way. If your loved one was part of the bigger community, you might want to have a bigger ceremony. But I would say conversations, have the talk, and just don't be afraid of just having communication.